Hello, and welcome to this presentation on the subject of really a lot of things that have been on my heart and mind recently. I think there have been a couple of recent interactions that have sort of pushed me all the way, so to speak, in terms of wanting to actually produce something to put online. Because these are things that I've been thinking about for a long time. I've had conversations with people. I watch a lot of debates. I've watched a lot of debates on this. And I don't know that anybody, well, we'll get into one thing, but I don't really know that the subjects that I want to cover in tonight's video are really being touched on as they should be. And I think that's causing a lot of the dialectic in the Calvinism, non-Calvinism discussion to just completely be off base, be completely on the wrong subject. All of this is, in my estimation, kind of missing the point, and hopefully I intend to show how and why in tonight's video. So you can see the slideshow here. I'm not going to read everything, but this is going to be a presentation in the realm of some pretty heavy and deep philosophical subjects like epistemology, justification, objective grounding and basis for things, experience, and assurance. I'm going to interact with a couple pieces, well, actually more than a couple, quite a few pieces of content online, but I'm also going to reference some personal testimony, some stories that I think could shed light on what I'm going to be going into tonight. So all of that we'll have to keep in mind. Now, before I begin, there is a disclaimer. If you're going to make a response to this video, if you're going to interact with me in the comments, or if you want to do a video or something, that's great, that's fine. But please, please, please try to be substantive. Do not post comments like this that I'm about to show you right here. Okay, I'm not going to read this, but for those of us who spend any amount of time in the online, Christian world or even the debate world, we know that we see material like this all the time, these sort of boomer, you are lost, and then if you come into the comment section and you post some boomer gibberish like this, I'm probably not going to respond to you. I'm sorry, but I just probably won't. Unless, of course, if you, the first person who can copy this and post it down in the comment section exactly as it appears, even with this typo on alleviate, whoever can do that exactly as it is, you will receive a heart reaction from me, and I will pin your comment to the top of the comment section. Thank you. Okay, so the first thing that came to mind that made me want to make this video was actually when I was watching the debate that Sam Shamoon did with Matt Slick over the subject of limited atonement. Now, for those of you who know Matt Slick, he's a feisty fella. He's a little prickly. But what actually intrigued me about what was going on was some of the stuff I saw in the comments section of that video. So, it's the comment section of a debate video. So you're gonna have your hits and your misses. Usually more misses. But one of the things that I found was a sort of channel doing some self-promotion. Not self-promotion, but just saying oh, I made this video. And I was I went down the rabbit hole. And because I like going down the rabbit holes. And so the first piece of content we're going to engage with is something I picked out very specifically because it ties into the rest of the subjects of what I'm going to get into in this video. So, first contender, this guy, the YouTube channel is called Aletheia, and if I pull it up here, we actually don't need to really even watch the video, because if you see what's on the screen right now with this comment section in another YouTube video and the title of the video here, you kind of already get a sense of where this is going. So he's essentially asking the question of assurance of salvation. And Alana L here, who's at this point pretty well known. I mean, for speaking out against Calvinism, I think she's been on Flowers channel. I think she's been on a bunch of other places, and MacArthur gave those comments recently where maybe I suppose you could say it's about her. I guess probably likely that it's about her. But anyway, so here's the dilemma, the dialectic as it's being presented. How do you know you're saved? Give me a plain answer. Okay, so that's the Aletheia sort of goober Calvinist question, right? Because I believe Jesus is God and he rose from the dead. And the response, I mean, this is kind of like yeah, but like you're kind of playing into the trap with this response because he's just going to say this. And so first major point of response to this, and I don't know if I have this on the next slide. Let's see. I do. Okay. Even if we take the dilemma, the debate, and accept it on their own premise, on their own grounds, the response doesn't work because there's a confusion, a fundamental confusion here between mechanism and objective basis. So how do you know you're saved? I mean, you can answer that in a lot of different ways, and what the answer given here by Alana is the sort of subjective side of the thing. What Aletheia doesn't realize, and what a lot of Calvinists doesn't realize, and the reason I'm referencing this video isn't because I'm trying to single out this guy. Anybody who's spent any amount of time in the Reformed dialectical world in these debates knows that this is an objection that's raised all the time. It's like, well, how do you know? And then if you're not prepared for this kind of stuff, it can really trip you up. So, and then you'll get because of what you did. Isn't it what you did? So you saved yourself, huh? No. So I have it here in my little, the presentation, which never lies, the spreadsheet, that there's a confusion here between mechanism and grounding. What do I mean by this? What is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is faith. But the objective basis or the grounding is Jesus Christ, God, the gospel, the work of salvation. So you can answer the question, and I think what a lot of Reformed people don't understand is that you can answer the question because of what God did. Obviously, we all say because of what God did. The mechanism by which you experience that assurance can't happen without faith. Does that make sense? And there's actually, I want to get into this next slide because I formulated an argument that I think highlights this point well. And I'm trying to think if there's anything important to mention about this before I get into it. I don't think so. I'll just put it on the screen now, and I will say I'm not going to read all the text here. If you want, you can pause the video, and you can take a look at this for yourself, and you can say, this guy's silly, or you can say, I like what he says. But the general overview, the purpose of what I'm trying to say here with this argument is that the Reformed position doesn't even meet the standards to me making this critique. Because you need to have all of the preconditions for having an objective basis of assurance to be just in saying that your assurance is real, and a Reformed person and a non-Reformed person are in the same boat in appealing to subjective experience and quote-unquote your actions when it comes to, do I have assurance? Do I experience assurance? And the purpose of this argument, one of the things that happened with this argument as I presented it to a lot of people is I kept getting this response where the response was, oh, you said, I mean, this is why I have the disclaimer right here. This disclaimer was actually not a part of the original statement. And the reason I had to add it is because I was getting responses from people saying, "Oh, you think Reformed people can have assurance? Like, what do you mean? I have assurance all the time. I just feel it. I just feel the assurance, man." Like, no, like that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying you don't feel that you experience assurance. What I'm saying is that you can't ground those experiences. You can't give me a justification in your paradigm for why I should believe that those experiences are valid. And I think this argument shows that because of the fact that, I mean, I'm not going to give any like personal details of my life or what's going on, but I am in a context where a lot of people have been exposed to this. And they're not just lay people. You know, these are people who are sort of higher academic context here. And I know that a lot more people than who I initially showed it to have also been exposed to it. And I've yet to receive an answer. Or even something attempting an answer. I did receive one response. And, you know, because I know the person who gave me the response and I respect them and I care about them and I wanted to be thoughtful and engage with it, I did engage with the entire response. But the response fell flat from the get-go because the response was premised on both a question-begging fallacy and a straw man. Because if you'll notice in my argument here, I have A right here, meaning that Jesus died for my sins. Okay? Now, Jesus dying for my sins is a necessary precondition for me to have an objective basis for assurance of salvation. If I experience salvation, if I'm going to ground that in something objective, it must be the case that Jesus died for my sins. If I have experiences of assurance of salvation, but it's not the case that Jesus died for my sins, my assurance is false or it's based in something not objective. Like my experience could be the thing. Maybe it's circular. So the answer that I got, the only answer that I've really received as a response to this conundrum is to say, the person basically changed my sentence A. They were like, we don't accept A. We need to change A so that A is going to be Jesus died for the sins of all those who would believe in him. Well, why is that question begging? Because to say that Jesus died for the sins of all those who would believe in him is the limited atonement position. And that's the very thing that's being critiqued by this argument, so you can't assume that. Not only that, but it's a straw man because that sentence A is not identical to my sentence A. And you cannot change an argument in order to make it easier to respond to. That's a straw man. Now, why is it the case that this argument in its structure is valid? And I'll show you why in the following slide if it will let me go to it, which it doesn't want to. I'll just click on it. Okay. As I've said here, in these kinds of arguments, all the preconditions have to be met. So we can think of a hypothetical example where A, B, C, and D, so there's 4 things, are a precondition to E. Well, what if I have A? What if I have B? What if I have C? But I don't have D? Do I have E? No. What's the easiest way to show this? Well, I'm not a car guy, but this is the example that I thought was a good way to show this. The necessary preconditions for my car to work properly. I have to have gas in my tank. The key has to be in the ignition. The spark plug has to be working. And I need the right type and amount of coolant in my, engine bay? I don't know where you put the coolant. I just put coolant in my car and I don't know where I put it. I just know that it worked because our shop mechanic helped me do it. When these preconditions are all met, then my car will work right. Well, what if I have gas in my tank? What if my key is in the ignition? What if my spark plug is working, but I ain't got no coolant? What if I have no coolant? Is my car going to work right? No. Also, as an added side note, I have it listed here that the 1689 confession will not help because if we actually pull this up, let's go to the 1689 confession of the assurance of grace and salvation. This is chapter 18. Let's just read this together, and we can examine under the premises of this argument. Remember, this argument, we can show or we can surmise that this confession doesn't solve the conundrum either. So here's an acknowledgement that you can experience false hopes and carnal presumptions of being in the favor of God in a state of salvation. And then I believe if we go down further... Okay, so this is the thing that I wanted to focus on. He says, this is certainly not, the writers of the confession say, this certainty is not a bare conjectural and probable persuasion, grounded upon a fallible hope, but an infallible assurance of faith founded on the blood and righteousness of Christ revealed in the gospel. Okay, that sounds good, but you're a Reformed person. You've given me no objective basis to believe that this right here, that this section of the proposition is for you. Why do I believe that this is for you? And in a little bit here, when I sort of rehash a discussion that I had recently, we're going to get into the big problem, right? Because so far, if you remember towards the start of this video, I started my response to the initial arguments from this guy about assurance on his own grounds, within the schema of accepting the sort of Reformed, I guess, paradigm, if you might say. So this is of no help. This shows why the preconditions have to be met. And now it's time to get into what I think the actual problem is, the actual big issue. And what it is, and it's on the next slide, but I want to say it first, is that Calvinism doesn't even have the right to bring these objections to begin with. Calvinism cannot get off the ground, so to speak, epistemically. Why is that? And that's because of this right here. The doctrine of the noetic effects of sin, or I guess it's called noetic total depravity sometimes. I've heard it called that before. What is the doctrine of noetic total depravity, or what do they say about the noetic effects of sin? Here's the big problem. Here's the glaring undercutting defeater, right? I think years ago I listened to, there was another Matt Slick debate where he debated Warren McGrew, and Warren points this point out in that debate. Okay, now I don't agree with Warren McGrew on everything, the dynamic omniscience thing. I'm definitely not on board there, okay? And I think he probably could have fleshed this out a lot harder and really nailed Matt in that debate, but the principle is the same, and I want to expound on it in this video because I think it's important. Just so you know that I'm not kind of making this up and just foisting things onto them that they don't accept, we can actually go back to the London Confession and come down to right here. This is paragraph 1. This is something that people who have interacted with Reformed faith, I'm sure, have been exposed to at some point. If not this paragraph specifically, then these ideas certainly. What I want you to focus on is this phrase right here. Enlightening their minds spiritually and savingly, especially to understand the things of God. Okay, R.C. Sproul is going to write an article for Ligonier Ministries. And he's going to say a couple things that are important to note as potential responses to the argument that I'm going to give, because there have been responses to the argument that I'm going to give. I don't think they work, and I'm going to show why in a little bit here. Generally speaking, the doctrine of the noetic effects of sin is to say that because of Adam's fall, your natural faculties are incapable of rightly reasoning about, understanding, or knowing God. And it's specifically about God because one of the things that happens, one of the objections that is often raised, that's sort of touched on in this article, is right here to say that the non-Christian can know some truth. And so they'll say, well, you're saying non-believers can't know things. I'm like, no, I'm not saying non-believers can't know things, okay? What I am saying is that under the Reformed conception of the noetic effects of total depravity, you, by default, by nature, will always think about God, believe about God, and feel and think about God in ways that are incorrect and self-serving to your own flesh. Not either that, or you'll suppress the truth and unrighteousness, you won't believe anything at all. So oftentimes in the sort of just nominal Reformed like life, I guess, or circles, it'll often be stated in terms of like, you look at people like Brandon Robertson, or you look at Stephen Furtick, you look at Kenneth Copeland, you look at all these, these wackos, right? And you'll say, this is the natural way, this is the natural response of man to think about God, in this way. Because it's self-seeking, it's self-gratifying, it's me up, it's him down, and you will always think and believe and act towards God in that way by your very nature. And you cannot rightly reason or think about God. Now here's the question. And I don't know if I have this on the next slide or if I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Okay, yeah, that's jumping ahead of myself. Here is the problem. Why does a Reformed person get to say that they're not doing that right now with their doctrine? Now, I want this to sort of sit and marinate a little bit, because the point that I'm going to make here is, if all of those things that were stated before are true of you by nature, what are you going to appeal to argue that you're not doing the same thing right now towards God with your Calvinistic theology? This is where I wanted to get into a discussion I had recently with a Calvinist that I know. And for private, I'm not going to give any names or any, like indicators of relationship here. Let's just say this is somebody whose privacy and name I respect, and I don't want to make this a personal matter of gossip. This is purely about the arguments that are presented. First of all, it should be noted that this is a very well-read person, probably read way more books in their life than I have, a seminary student, same as me, higher academic, master degree, PhD level stuff going on here. And this individual did not deny, when I brought up the noetic sin problem against him, he did not deny that my conception, that my understanding of the Reformed view of noetic total depravity was false. He agreed with me and he affirmed me in that understanding. What happened next, though, is that when I asked for his justification for the question that I previously asked, how do you know that your Calvinism, that your beliefs that you're espousing right now in this conversation are not also a product of the noetic total depravity corrupting your thoughts and your heart towards God and causing you to believe falsely about him? His justification went to, I know, well, specifically I asked him, how do you know that you're understanding the Bible right? Because he's saying, well, the Bible just teaches Calvinism. And I'm like, yeah, you've got all these noetic sin problems where you're always going to go to the Bible and reason and feel and understand and think falsely about it because of your total depravity in a noetic sense. And you're always going to come to self-serving conclusions. How do you know that you're not doing that right now with Calvinism? And the answer he gave me was, I know that I'm understanding it rightly and that I'm correct in my Calvinism because I'm born again. And I said, okay, how do you know you're born again? And this is where the circularity problem comes in. Because when you ask somebody what is their basis for believing in the new birth of themselves and being born again, the referent, the thing that's pointed to, is not actually anything objective. I asked him this, and the answer that I got was, because I have an experience, because I've experienced the new birth, because I have an experience of this thing. Okay? So the circle that comes into play here is, I know I understand the Bible because I'm born again. So I know I understand the Bible because I'm born again. I know I'm born again because I have an experience of being born again. I know my experience of being born again is valid because I understand the Bible. And I understand the Bible, and I know I understand the Bible because I'm born again. And I know that I'm born again because I have an experience of being born again. And I know my experience of being born again is valid because I understand the Bible. And then this is the circularity problem. Now, in the context of this discussion that I was having, he tried to argue that circularity is okay because he correctly observed that on the ultimate level, at some point, when you get to the most baseline axiomatic metalogical assumptions, everybody's going to have to get circular. However, circularity at the meta-paradigmatic level is not the same thing as circularity within the paradigm itself. And this is what I was calling him out on, And there was no answer. Now, why do I think that this is important? Well, first of all, why do I think that this is even the way to go? Why do I title this video and why do I call this discussion saying a lot of, if not all of the critiques and interactions with Calvinism sort of get it wrong and miss the point? And that's because I think that this kind of presuppositional critique cuts the head off the snake, so to speak. I'm cutting it at the head. So much of what we do is we're up here in the level of the conclusions, and it's this Bible verse means this. This Bible verse means this. This means this. This means this. And we're going on and on and on. And when we're dealing with paradigm versus paradigm type of stuff, right? So you got these two paradigms and they're clashing. The evidence is the Bible verses, the teachings themselves are usually, I say usually because I know people have been convinced, but they're usually not enough to convince people. And the reason for that is because it's way too easy for a Reformed person to simply reinterpret the Bible passages that seem to contradict Calvinism in conjunction with their Calvinism. So it's I've heard it said, I think Thompson says this, where he's when I read a passage that seems to contradict Calvinism, I already know what a Calvinist has to say about it before I even engage with them to preserve their paradigm. And that's exactly right. And this is why I say that Reformed theology has to be critiqued presuppositionally. Not simply because of this. Not because it's not prepared for presuppositional critiques, which it's not. And if you want a good example of this, by the way, you can watch this debate right here. So this is I feel like I've referenced a lot of Matt Slick debates tonight, but Matt Slick had this debate with his Orthodox guy, and the Orthodox guy levels a presuppositional critique against Matt Slick's Reformed position. And in this video specifically, he goes on to give a Mormon testimony as a justification for why he believes and how he knows, which obviously doesn't work. But the point still stands that oftentimes Reformed people are only familiar with the way that Reformed people do presuppositional apologetics, and they're not used to having those kinds of critiques done against them. So I also want to highlight this second bullet point right here in terms of what presuppositional apologetics is and isn't, because a lot of people think presuppositional apologetics is just, oh, dude, you're so dumb. You just presuppose God and therefore God. That's so dumb. Who would believe you? That, okay, that's not what presuppositional apologetics is. There's an element of saying, yes, you have to presuppose God to make sense of the world. But where I think presuppositional apologetics actually is even stronger is when presuppositional apologetics is used to have the paradigmatic battle at the presuppositional axiomatic level instead of the evidentialist level, because like I mentioned earlier, it's too easy when you're at the evidentialist level to simply take bits and pieces of evidence and say, well, I can fit that into my paradigm like this. I can fit this into my paradigm like that. And it goes nowhere. And by the way, lest we are tempted to assert or suggest that the Reformed camp does not think that presuppositional apologetics is valid, which I don't know who would think that. I mean, a lot of the top Reformed guys do this kind of stuff. And I mean, even the transcendental argument, the Bonsenstein debate, right? Famous debate, what was this, the 80s or something? I don't even know. Long time ago. So long ago, you can tell that it's an old debate by the quality of the audio when you listen to the video. This debate that White and Durbin had against a couple atheists in Utah, Durbin and White also argued presuppositionally on the basis of the transcendental argument against these atheist guys. Now, this debate was, a dumpster fire. Speaking of which, I was actually here personally. This debate was something else to be at, because you can't see, he's behind the Derb dog right now. But Dr. Clark, essentially spent the entire debate ranting about Godzilla, and then he challenged the audience to drink antifreeze. So that was pretty fun. I mean, yeah, there's the antifreeze on the table right there. That was a trip. But the point of all this is to say that in the Reformed world, presuppositional and transcendental critiques are accepted and valid. The problem is that I guess there's just like an unawareness, because these guys and this guy don't realize that the same exact critiques that they're making of atheists for being unable to give an account for knowledge claims for truth propositions, the same thing applies to their own Calvinism because of noetic total depravity. This even falls into the same realm of... Let's see if I can find this for you guys, actually, because this is a very important... Let's go to Google. Let's go to Prophet Google. And let's go to Alvin Plantinga, Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. Okay, so Alvin Plantinga's Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. Go look this up. Go study it. I can give you the sort of Spark Notes version right now. Basically, what Alvin Plantinga argues is that if you're an evolutionary materialist, if you're a naturalist, you have no basis to believe that the beliefs that you have are actually true. Because if you're matter in motion, if your brain chemicals fizzing, if you're one molecule running into that molecule that produces consciousness in your monkey suit brain, then all evolution is after is producing a state of affairs in your brain to maximize your survival and reproduction, not to actually give you truth. So you'd only have a basis to believe that your beliefs in your head are beneficial to your survival and reproduction, and not actually in relation in any meaningful way to objective truth. The same critique applies to Reformed theology here, because if you believe in noetic total depravity and determinism, then not only can you not reason properly about things of utmost importance like theological matters, but all your thoughts and your beliefs are just a product of previous factors, one domino running into another to produce that thought. Moving on to the next slide here. Okay. We already went through this. Yeah, this was the argument I brought up earlier. So this is I think the sticking point. Like a lot of the stuff that I've talked about tonight and mentioned is like, yeah, it's moving and it's, strong, but this is where I think the Reformed paradigm is defeated. And if we can prove the internal inconsistency and invalidity of a system, we can invalidate the whole system, which is why I say that this argument is a cut it off at the head. Like, why waste all the time going through, this? I think this Bible verse means this. I think this Bible verse means that. I'm just going to say, you can't give an account for how you know anything in your paradigm. Done. The debate's over, man. Like, once you resort to circular reasoning, once you say, well, I just know that I understand the Bible because I'm born again. And I know that I'm born again because I've experienced the new birth. And I know that I've experienced the new birth because I understand the Bible and it tells me that I'm what the experience of the new birth is supposed to be like. It's like once you accept that circle, that's an invalid form of reasoning. We can dispense with the whole system on that basis alone. Not only because it's circular, but on a more pragmatic level, because this is total depravity. This is the linchpin of Calvinistic soteriology. If this argument at least proves total depravity false, which it does, then the whole system built on total depravity is also not true. Do we understand this? Why? What are the other reasons that this might be concerning? Okay, this is something that I thought was really interesting too. On a more practical, normative, day-to-day level, this ends up sounding and acting really Mormon. I know that sounds strange. So first of all, I've got the cred, I guess, when it comes to speaking on Mormon. So I was a Mormon for 17 years. I understand the mentality. I've lived the experiences. I got dunked for the dead, when I was 12. I know what Mormonism teaches and thinks. But more importantly, I know what it feels like in terms of lived experience to be in Mormonism. And before I get to these points, I think the key to note is going to be this right here. What do I mean when I say that it's a faulty metaphysic? Both the Mormon and the Calvinist position are kind of premised on the idea that there's a true objective reality that's true about the world. So we're not talking about like God, but there's actually a reality that's true about the world we live on Earth that is completely inaccessible to just not human sense experience, but to like all of human faculty and experience in general. The way this works out practically is that in Mormonism, they generally say it like this. It's like, if you come to critique them on the fact that the Book of Mormon has no evidence, sometimes what they'll say is, well, it ultimately doesn't matter. I don't need evidence because I know it's true anyway because I've experienced the truthfulness of it. And so it could be the case that it's not consonant with the real world, quote unquote, as it appears to us, but it's still true in an objective way. We just don't know. Now, the parallel to this little predicament in the Reformed world is that there's an objective reality, which is the way that God sees the world. So God sees our world, Earth, and everything that happens on it as it really is. And then there's the way we see it. And the way we see it is all wrong. Going based on the conversation that I had with this guy recently, that's even the case post-conversion. So even when you're born again and your eyes are open and you've received the enlightenment, this is still true of you. And so this is why I get statements like this, where it's just like, I don't care if Reformed theology violates the so-called principles of logic and epistemology. I know it's true because I've experienced it. And so not only this guy, but another person who's very close to me, I asked the same question. I said, okay, wait a minute. If we're going to grant circular reasoning, if we're going to say that circular reasoning at any level, in any context is acceptable, why can I not just say, well, I'm just Mormon then? Well, I know Mormonism is true because I accept it, or because I experience it. And I know my experience is valid because Mormonism is true. And to my shock, the response that I got was, why don't we do that? And I was like, no, you're missing the point. Mormonism is not true. The point is to show that we can't do this. I've even heard it said, sort of in a roundabout way, that, from our perspective, it seems like Arminianism, by which they mean, general notions of free will and human responsibility are true. But from God's perspective, it's really not. Also, this quote right here is an interesting one that I want to focus on because a couple years ago, I remember bringing up this same critique in... I got invited by a good Reformed friend of mine to this sort of evening Bible study thing from his church. And I was there, and after the discussion, we're sitting around the campfire, hanging out, talking. And it's a bunch of theology nerds from seminary, right? So obviously we're talking about theological matters. And I brought up the objection. Now back then, I was not able to articulate it as clearly or cogently or powerfully as I'm trying to do in tonight's video. But this friend of mine, who's conscientious and has a level of philosophical training, despite the fact that I didn't present it well, he understood what I was saying. And to my great shock and awe, this is the response that I got. to the objectivity problem. It doesn't break out of the circularity. It doesn't solve the problem. The answer that I got was faith punches through doubt. So all this stuff that we're talking about justifying our beliefs and justifying our experiences and providing objective basis for things, it's like faith just punches through doubt. Okay, that's this. That's this right here. I think that's probably all I wanted to say. I really hope that, and we'll get to anticipated objections in a bit, but I hope that this was all presented. I know this was a lot of content to digest, a lot of stuff to think about, but I do hope it was presented in a clear enough way to be able to be understood. Going back here, I can't stress this enough. Ultimately, the criticism, if you take nothing else from this video but the main criticism, it's this right here, that when we go to argue against Reformed theology on a presuppositional level, the argument is, how do you justify your claims to have knowledge about what the true Christian faith is, given that you deny anybody can know or believe true things about God by nature? It either ends up being a question-begging fallacy or a circular reasoning fallacy. Actually, both. Because, a circular reasoning fallacy is ultimately a question-begging fallacy because you start with a thing that you're trying to prove, which is question-begging. And for Reformed people who are aware of the potency of this critique, ultimately what you'll get is this, a version of this. What I got in my conversation was essentially if you're trying to reason and understand and think about theology from a human perspective, you're never going to get it. You just have to experience it. God just has to transform you, and he'll enlighten you so that you'll know. But the obvious response to this is to say, why are you trying to convince me then? Like, why are we even having this discussion? If you can't convince me, and I can't be convinced, who cares? And, I will give credit where credit is due. This person, knowing that that's the true critique, essentially said, well, I'll just pray for you. Because that's all you can do. If this circular, unprovable, unknowable system is true, because you can't even know that it's true unless you first have an experience of its truthfulness, and you have to sort of prima facie assume that your experience is valid, then the only way to know is if God, I guess, kind of like beams the understanding into your mind. And that's it. But for those of us who are in the world of understanding that there is an order to nature, there's an order to the created world, that we're made in the image of God, and it's precisely because of that image that we're able to think correctly about him when confronted with revelation, we know that this kind of circularity doesn't work. You can't be circular in a debate. That's a fallacy, and if you engage in circular reasoning, you lose. You lose the debate. Now, there was one anticipated objection that I thought it would be good to cover. That is to say, what if I'm an anti-logician? What if I think that logic is bunk? One of the responses that I've gotten is, it doesn't matter what's logical or illogical. It's just what the Bible says. And on the surface, that sounds good, and that sounds pious, that sounds humble. And to a certain degree, we would even agree that what the Bible says takes precedent over things that make sense to me. Because it may not make sense to me that God is Trinity, but I believe it by faith. The problem, though, is that when this critique comes from a Reformed person, it doesn't escape This right here. The question-begging problem. Because under their Reformed paradigm, they haven't established that they can know this to begin with. It's just what the Bible's... I thought you, by nature, can only reason and think incorrectly about spiritual things. Self-servingly. Ways that worship and glorify the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. I thought that was the case. Why do you get to say this when this is true? You don't. This second point right here is what I've already touched on when I brought up the Mormon epistemology metaphysics similarities. But the second point is actually pretty good, and I forgot to mention it, so we're going to mention it right now. Not the best response, because a consistent Reformed person can just say, that's because your perception of reality is flawed because of total depravity. Yeah, they could respond that way, but then this is true. We're back where we started, because the Calvinist is making knowledge claims about states of affairs in reality that are shooting themselves in the foot. If this applies to me, then it applies to you. And therefore, you can't claim this right here. Do we understand this? This is why, in my opinion, Calvinism is defeated. Not because all these Bible verses that the boomers throw back and forth. Oh, not willing that any should perish. Ha ha ha. A Reformed person can just say that, well, that just means not willing that any of the elect should perish. If we want to really demolish the Reformed paradigm, we have to cut it off at the head, and this is the way to do it. Again, this is the end of the video. I'd love to hear back, love to hear engagement and response to what I've said here tonight. Just remember, please, 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 do not do this. I don't want to see King Jesus Bible in all caps in the chat as one word. Not that I don't think Jesus is the king and the Bible is Jesus's word. Obviously it is. Obviously we think this. But this kind of goofy stuff, please, please, please do not do this. I think that's all I had. I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said. I'm going to go ahead and save this and upload and hope that I get some meaningful response. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.